today's the day we celebrate our service in person at the Lower Warning Meeting House. And that's a challenging name for me to say, so I'm going to say it one more time. It's the day we come together to actually celebrate our in-person worship at the Lower Warner Meeting House. And it's kind of a neat thing. The building itself was built in the mid-1840s, so we're actually able to celebrate our worship in a way very similar to the way people did it 180 years ago. And actually, this week is actually a pretty special week for me as well, because this week marks 2 years I've been the pastor at this church. You know, and that first year was a pretty challenging year. You know, COVID was going on. For most of that year, we were only meeting online. And so we've only been meeting in person for a little over the past year. So it's been a real joy for me to recognize that we got through that first year together with all of its challenges. And in this kind of second year we've been together, that, you know, we've continued to kind of grow and kind of invite new people in and share with new people from around the area. And so it's just a real joy to be a part of all that. So I feel so fortunate and so blessed to share all that with all of you and celebrate that together with you. But you know, as I thought about all these things, my time these past 2 years, the opportunity to worship in a largely unchanged 180-year-old church, our church's congregation, founded back in 1772, so celebrating our 250th year as a congregation, this beautiful building we're blessed to have, you know, and our town, the town of Warner, actually turning 250 years old in just a couple of years. You know, and as I thought about all those things, what I began to think about was legacy. You know, what does it mean when something is a legacy? What is a legacy? And what are the things that come along with a legacy? So I actually looked up the word legacy, and the definition of a legacy is actually something quite simple. A legacy is something received from a predecessor or something received from the past. So, of course, our church building here is a legacy. The Lower Warner Meeting House is a legacy. And all those other things I mentioned are legacies. But what's kind of funny is that the literal definition of the word legacy, I don't think really captures what we usually think of when we think of a legacy. That yes, a legacy is something that we receive. But when we use the word legacy to describe something, it usually implies much more than just receiving a thing. That we also inherit a responsibility. Because with a legacy becomes a responsibility to care for that legacy, to share that legacy with the people around us. Also to preserve that legacy and to pass that legacy on to the next generation, to pass it on to the people who come after us. And I think we see that idea really exemplified as we look at our historical society, as we look at Lynn Clark and all the people who work with the historical society to care for the Lower Warner Meeting House. Because over the years, they have cared for it, they've maintained it, and also all the people who came before them cared for it, maintained it, and when necessary, repaired it, so it could carry forward from the past up to us. And so as we look at this idea of a legacy, we really see how the Historical Society has responsibly handled the legacy of the Lower Warner Meeting House. Because they do the work to shape that legacy's role both in the present and prepare it for the future. And just as they are the caretaker of a legacy, those of us who are part of our church are caretakers of a legacy. The legacy of this building, the legacy of our congregation as an organization. And for all of us who put our faith in God, for all of us who put our faith in Jesus, we are also caretakers of a legacy. For all of us who put our faith in God and put our faith in Jesus, we're caretakers of the legacy of the global church. And as you think about that, I mean, that's an incredible responsibility, but it's also an incredible opportunity. So as we think about that, I mean, how do we do that sort of thing well? I mean, what do we do to share that legacy with the people around us? And what do we do to actually preserve that legacy and pass it on to the next generation? Those are some big questions. and they feel like big questions. So how do we answer them? Well, fortunately, we're not the first generation to ask those questions. Concern about those issues and the answers to those questions actually date all the way back to the very first generation of the church. So let's see how that first generation of church leaders answered those questions. So to do that, what I wanted to look at this morning is a letter written by the Apostle Peter. Now, we know it in our Bibles as the book of 2 Peter. But as we often talk about, when Peter was writing this, he was not considering himself writing the Bible. What we know as a Bible would not exist for a few hundred years. What Peter was doing is he was sitting down to write a letter, or more likely dictate a letter for someone else to write for him, to be distributed to all the churches in the area. But it's a letter to the whole church, which means that the recipients of that letter are, of course, the people who were in those churches at that time, but it's a letter to all churches across time. So that letter is written to you. That letter is written to me. And as we look at what Peter tells us, as Peter starts out the letter, he reinforces some of the key teachings that Jesus had. And he reinforces the events of Jesus' life. And he reminds us that he was there with Jesus, that he saw these things. These aren't things he heard about, but he saw all those things. And he makes clear that he is one of the caretakers of the legacy of Jesus. That as a caretaker, he's the one who's been one of the ones who've been carrying that forward. And then he goes on to tell us that he is now passing that legacy on to his audience. He's passing that legacy on to the other people in the church. And over time, that legacy is now passed on to you and to me. And as we look at Peter's letter, and we're just going to look at a few short excerpts from it, as we look at that, we'll see that as he's passing on that legacy, he starts out by telling us that some key elements of Jesus' teaching, and he's kind of reinforcing those elements. He's reinforcing things that he's told his audience before. And then he goes on to say, I will always remind you of these things, even though you know them and are firmly established in the truth you now have. So Peter starts out by saying, I know I'm repeating myself. I know I've said these things to you before. I know you know these things. I know you not only know them, I know that you're actually practicing them and you're actually living them in your life. Well, if he knows all that, why is he repeating himself? Well, he goes on to tell us. I think it is right to refresh your memory as long as I live in the tent of this body, because I know that I will soon put it aside, as our Lord Jesus Christ has made clear to me. In other words, Peter knows that he's reaching the end of his life. And as he carries on, and I will make every effort to see that after my departure, you will always be able to remember these things. So he's acknowledging that his life will soon come to an end. And as far as we can tell, Peter died probably somewhere between the year 60 and the year 68. And church tradition tells us that he was probably executed by the Emperor Nero. So he's at a point in his life where he knows that his time here is coming to an end. That he soon will not be able to be one of the people carrying this legacy forward anymore. But as long as he can, he is going to do what he can to pass that legacy on. So he's trying to provide his audience with a clear foundation of understanding. Repeatedly reinforcing things that he has said in the past. And then he goes on to say that as he passes that on to us, we now are the caretakers. That we, his audience, that first century audience, this 21st century audience, we are now the caretakers. That it will become our job, that it is our job to share that legacy with those around us and to pass that legacy on to the generations after us. And he goes on to tell us, well, here's what I think you'll need to do that. And of course, that includes things like teaching. That includes things like regularly reinforcing the information, the sort of thing we've seen him do already. But then he makes clear that there's something else that we need to do. There's something else that's even more important than those things. An important aspect, possibly the most important aspect of carrying that legacy forward is living a life consistent with the fundamental tenets of what Jesus taught us. So in these last few minutes, what I'd like to do is quickly see what Peter tells us those fundamental tenets are. What are those fundamental ideas? And one of the things that he appears to be concerned about is a misunderstanding of our faith-based relationship with God. That yes, our relationship with God is faith in Jesus and faith in the work of Jesus. But he wants to make clear that that's not the whole story. That there's more that comes after faith. There's more that we're called to do if we're going to actually carry this legacy forward. Now, it doesn't mean that our salvation requires more than faith, but carrying that legacy requires something more. And here's what Peter tells us. Make every effort to add to your faith. Add goodness. And to goodness add knowledge. And to knowledge add self-control. And to self-control add perseverance. And to perseverance add godliness. And to godliness add mutual affection. And to mutual affection add love. So Peter says, make every effort to add to your faith. That, yes, our relationship with God is one of faith, and you might be tempted to stop there, but don't stop there, that there is more, because we need to develop that relationship. And the way we develop our relationship with God is through our relationship with other people. And to develop that relationship and to have a meaningful relationship, we have to have a life of meaning. We have to have a life of purpose, that we have to take action. So we need to be sure to add these key things to our faith. And as he goes through these things, and he starts with add goodness. In other words, be a good person, right? Don't just say, I'm good to go. I don't have to worry about anybody else. Be a good person. Be the neighbor that you want to have. Be the friend that you want to have. Be kind to one another. When you see people in need, help those people. Be an active part of making this world a better place. And then he says, add knowledge. So study and learn. Understand what's happening around you. Know what's happening in the world. Know what's happening in your own town. Know what's happening in the lives of the people around you. And understand the reasons for your faith. Don't have blind faith. Kind of dig in and understand why you believe what you believe. And listen to viewpoints that are different than yours. And don't be afraid to question your faith. And don't be afraid to doubt your faith. But expand your knowledge, expand your understanding. Dig in to understand why you believe what you believe. And then he says, maintain self-control. So when you encounter things that challenge you, that challenge your viewpoint, that challenge your worldview, don't blow your top. Be in control. Hear things. Listen well. Manage your temper. Live a life of balance. Don't be surrounded by excess. Don't be overcome by excess. Don't live beyond your means. Be in control. Live well. Live well with the people around you. And then he goes on to say, add perseverance. In other words, recognize that good things take time. Be willing to put that time in. And when you're working on something that can be part of making someone's life better or making the world a better place, recognize that things will not necessarily fall into place instantly, that you may have to invest lots of time in doing that. Be willing to do that. Be willing to do what it takes to achieve good things. Don't be easily discouraged. Trust the call you have on your life. Trust those things that you feel called that you're supposed to do. And be willing to invest yourself in those things. Invest your time in those things. And then he finishes up by saying, add godliness, mutual affection, and love. In other words, be patient, be merciful, be caring, care for one another. Be willing to take chances on people. Be willing to step into the difficult aspects of people's lives and be a part of that. And look at the world through a lens of love, not of judgmentalism, not of outsiderism, not of condemnation, but look at the world through a lens of love. And be willing to really step out in love. Be filled with love. Interact with one another in love. And Peter would remind us how much Jesus gave to demonstrate the power of love. And that's the legacy that we've inherited. And Peter tells us why it is so important to live out these things. Because Peter goes on to say, for if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. In other words, he says that if you stop at faith, if your attitude about your relationship with God is that I've got faith, I'm good, my ticket's punched, I've got nothing else to worry about, he says, well, that's going to be ineffective and unproductive. But if we embrace those things, and we embrace faith and its call to responsibility, to do something meaningful with what we have, to embrace this legacy that we have received, that we can then go on and do more. That yes, having faith is important, but it is not enough to just have faith. Faith is just a starting point. That it's the starting point of our place in a long legacy of faith, a long historic legacy. Embracing what faith means embracing that corresponding call to action. So what Peter is telling us is that we have received this incredible legacy, that we should do all we can during the very short time we have on this earth to do meaningful and valuable things with the legacy we have received. And meaningful and valuable things are things that impact the lives of those around us. Things that we do that actually lift up the people around us. He says, in addition to that we should do all we can to pass this legacy on, healthy and whole, and better than we found it, to the generations that come after us. So as we celebrate the legacy of so many things around us, of our church, of the Lower Warren Meeting House, let's embrace this legacy of faith that we have all received, and let's step fully into it, investing in people around us and doing what we can to maybe repair some of the damage that's happened, but to also carry it forward and pass it on to the next generation.